Dragon Age used to be uttered in the same sentences as its stablemate RPG, Mass Effect, called a spiritual successor to Baldur's Gate, and was considered at one point one of the most impactful RPG series of all time. Starting from the very first title, they dropped back in 2009, Dragon Age Origins, which would light the RPG world on fire. This torch would be fumbled mostly by the often marred sequel, Dragon Age 2, which launched in 2011, especially as the corporatization of BioWare would begin to take hold, and they would change in structure and design, losing many of their key talent in the process. Dragon Age Inquisition, which launched in 2014, would come next, and was, despite a controversial reception amongst some original series fans, rated quite well critically, and rated well initially from the player base, going on to become the best-selling game in the series with little competition around it by a wide margin at over 12 million copies sold. It would then take the series another 10 years to release a new game, Dragon Age The Veilguard, which launched in 2024 and is mostly the subject of this video, although we will cover briefly each Dragon Age release because of the important context therein. This is a unique case for the Death of a Game series, a series where we investigate the largest contributing factors to the death or process of dying of a game or company by utilizing a timeline of events filled with clues and bits of evidence, but most importantly, we activate our detective intuition, especially during the final deduction, where we crack the case for good. In case you missed any of the clues along the way, this is a unique case, because Dragon Age The Veilguard is not only not a multiplayer game, which we normally cover in the series, it might have very well led to the death of the entire Dragon Age series itself. Without any more belaboring, we have a story of friendship and magic. Think a heist film meets Harry Potter, which is supposed to be Dragon Age, to the case detectives. The story begins where the Dragon Age series begins, with the first game, titled Dragon Age Origins. The Origins part referring to the starting stories or origins of each character background you could choose for your character, shedding the annoying and superfluous boring backgrounds for characters typical in most RPGs. You know, where it's just like a blurb. These origins played like an entire active campaign in a sense, that would result in you being thrust into the main plot of the game, the battle against the literally rising and erupting Darkspawn. The Dragon Age series started as being a true RPG, featuring a fully customizable and playable party, the ability to switch from action and top-down isometric cameras, as well as pause during combat to issue orders to your companions. Or you can program some behaviors in them, like in Neverwinter Nights, allowing them to make their own decisions within a set of simple rules. Your decisions mattered in this game, starting from character creation at the start of the game, which would vastly change your starting experience, something that SWTOR would mimic in some ways too successfully. The visual style of Dragon Age Origins is often slanted for being a bit blocky or crude in some ways, but personally, I love the art style and think that it was an intentional style that makes the game feel darker and grittier, which matches the actual tone of the game and the story. I actually think it's a bit like a dark fantasy look in a sense, even if it's a bit generic. It really fits with the feeling of hopelessness throughout the game, and how harsh scenarios and people can get with things. I mean, the game starts with you taking a poison that either kills you or turns you into a Grey Warden, and you watch a guy die in front of you before taking yours. Ultimately, dark or not, this RPG's first entry into the series would sell really well, at 3 million plus copies, and go on to be considered one of the best RPGs of all time. But the key to the story of Dragon Age is each game feels fairly different to the game before it, and obviously any other game, which is strange because of how different that actually ends up feeling. But EA BioWare was making similar transitions elsewhere, like when they turned Mass Effect 1, which was more like an RPG first then shooter, into a shooter first then RPG with the subsequent titles, to great success, selling way better in the process. This would then dictate how other BioWare products were going to be built, which would affect the sequel of Dragon Age as well, which would actually lead to the departure of a longtime employee, Brent Knowles, who served as the joint lead designer on Origins alongside James Olin, who would go on to lead SWTOR as the game's director, and Mike Laidlaw, who most people think of when they think of Dragon Age. Brent Knowles, though, later would claim his departure was because he could see the writing on the wall, due to the success of Mass Effect 2 and the transition to more action gameplay for the studio after 2010, and thus away from making classic RPGs. BioWare, now at EA's behest, wanted to make everything action-oriented, and thus would lead to the next Dragon Age title in the series, the most hated of the original 3 games. The majority of the rest of talent would transition to work on the next title too, dropping Dragon Age 2 at a breakneck speed just 2 years after the first. This Dragon Age would feature Hawk, a new protagonist to fit the new location, Kirkwall, where the majority of the game, if not all of it, would be based in. This would not only lead to repetitive missions and maps, it would lead to repetitive overall gameplay too, a narrative that feels inconsequential and just hobbled together. Dragon Age 2 is the Dragon Age that narratively does the least and makes you feel more like you're running chores sometimes rather than on an epic adventure. An adventure that only introduces the main villains of the game at the very end, which is just strange. Dragon Age 2 was a hub-and-spoke type of design to a game, where everything is contained in one area, and then enemies only seemingly attack at night for some reason, to which they spawn in waves, again, for some reason. The combat doesn't even feel markedly better here either. That's because a sci-fi game based on shooting will likely change a lot when it gets more action-oriented compared to a fantasy-style RPG, which in some ways might feel like it loses aspects when more focused on fast-paced combat, like the ability to tactically pause and control companions and more. Another controversial aspect was playing as Hawk, a new human-only character who seems to have the majority of their dialogue written to make them seem as indifferent as possible to the game's plot and story, kind of like me, versus being able to play as an elf or dwarf as well, with these deep backstories and backgrounds that the game was known for. Dragon Age 2 was more like a worse content upgrade or expansion than a full-fledged sequel, which has made it age rather poorly, while its predecessor still finds major play today. Though DA2 did show out with some of its more memorable companion characters, such as Varric, Isabella, and Fenris. Varric would essentially become the game's pseudo-storyteller from that point on, and a main character associated with the series from that point on as well, due to his massive popularity. Or maybe it was Bianca's. Hey detectives, if you're watching this video and not currently subscribed to the channel, or a member of the channel, or a member of our Patreon, please consider supporting the channel further. We can't and choose not to rely entirely on ad revenue, as it dictates the kind of content we have to make too much. Because of this, any and all support elsewhere is greatly appreciated, including super thanks and super chats. Without this kind of support and sponsors that we take on the channel, we simply wouldn't be able to afford to create content at our current scale right now. So your help isn't just appreciated, it's keeping the lights on in my house and on at my operation, nerdSlayer Studio. But thank you for the continued support, including those who don't have the means to support more. But back to the case, detectives. BioWare would get a bit more time on their next Dragon Age game, and with it would make some pretty big leaps in gameplay, direction, and graphical presentation, being the first Dragon Age game that visually was first in its class, really, seriously. Dragon Age Inquisition would drop November 18th, 2024, and is really a fascinating title to play and study. And that's because the critical reception of it, and the original Dragon Age fan reception of it, and the new Dragon Age fan reception of it are all kind of different. Firstly, Inquisition only barely did worse critically than Dragon Age Origins, at an 85 out of 100 from 45 different critics, managing to impress there hugely with its improved action gameplay, improved dialogue, and world and character cameo/story continuations as well, but even introducing some cool new characters too. Now, amongst fans, the reception, as I said, is mixed. Inquisition has some great aspects to it. It feels more massive in scale, and it's definitely an upgrade to 2. And, well, obviously, it looks really good graphically. But the original game's art style is mostly abandoned here, with the game looking more like a typical fantasy game now. Inquisition might be one of the first major single-player MMORPGs we have encountered too. Now, bear with me, I know it's only really a co-op game for special missions or dungeons, but the actual gameplay of Inquisition is just like that of an MMORPG. You spend time waiting for missions or quests to complete, sometimes up to multiple hours or days, you explore largely empty zones with few points of interest, and finally, a hefty payload of copy-paste quests from an MMORPG in the early 2000s, complete with a resource system that you cannot avoid as well. But those quests feel even stranger when your character is the leader of the Inquisition, formed to save the world from a breach in the folds of the fabric of that world. A similar problem Mass Effect 3 had tonally as well, where it's hard to do the classic adventurer quests when you're so damn important to the main plot, which is in this dire situation. Look, I think there's a lot to like with Inquisition, but I can't deny, without modding the game for me, unlike any other Dragon Age game, even though I like it more than the second game, it's basically unplayable for me. Mods to get rid of the ridiculous amount of quest bloat in the form of the war table and waiting for things to complete, fix the horrible loot in the game that rarely makes you feel epic, and to control your companion's approval, since to be honest, that's the best part of the game. The best part of Dragon Age Inquisition is the companions and your continued relationship with certain characters based on choices made in previous Dragon Age games. This, like Mass Effect, makes the game feel connected in a way you just can't shake. Though the thing about Mass Effect and Dragon Age, two games that inevitably had their fates linked together, whether or not you want me to mention them in the same sentences or video, is that Mass Effect games all feel and look within the same world. Sure, gameplay changed, but the gameplay still looks the same. Dragon Age, on the other hand, had no such identity, unfortunately, and with each game looking unique to each other, and even playing unique to each other, that was only made worse. Hell, the later Dragon Ages have class-locked armors. This was going to contribute heavily to why the game would be shelved and stuck in development hell, and would ultimately end with BioWare deciding to disregard most of that anyway, with their fourth Dragon Age title later. Development would begin on a new project at BioWare, behind the scenes coded originally as Project Joplin, and was set to be the next entry in the Dragon Age series. Mike Laidlaw, David Gator, Casey Hudson, and Mark Dara, and more, would start the project's production sometime in 2015. The game was initially supposed to be a smaller, more narrative-focused Dragon Age game set in the Tevinter Imperium, an undiscovered location. But this project would be anything but smooth, as early on in development BioWare would suffer from handling too many projects at the same time, working on a Dragon Age project and a Mass Effect project, which would later become Andromeda, a game that, well, will get its own episode on Death of a Game. And then of course, most infamously, already featured on the series, Anthem. Gator was then put in charge of the story of writing Anthem, while also still working on the new incubating Dragon Age project. This would lead to burnout for him, and he would depart in January of 2016. Gator being a name associated with the very Dragon Age name, really. Gator would later explain it was also due to a culture shift at BioWare, due to the EA takeover. Feeling like creativity was stifled and even adversarial to the executives, Gator wasn't the only developer to leave Dragon Age as a series either. BioWare would lose tons more of their talent on both Dragon Age and Mass Effect during this tumultuous time. Within the next 2 years, Project Joplin would be cancelled after just 2 years of production and work. But the remaining developers associated with Dragon Age were still around, mostly, and would stick with things, eventually being granted another opportunity for another project, this time codenamed Morrison, which would restart development on the next game. Project Morrison, reportedly, was supposed to have live service bones, but ultimately would have its online aspects killed after the failure of Anthem. This would actually remain as a part of the game's legacy, as what would ultimately launch would have many of the same bones. Sometime in 2018, BioWare was given another 18 months, as they were with Dragon Age 2, to redo the entire game and make it more action combat-centric in the process too. Casey Hudson, during the new Dragon Age game's first major teasing, which happened December 19, 2018, would claim that the new game was set to be a live experience, which would allow for continued storytelling after the main story was concluded, also known as a live service game. Dragon Age 4 would take on its new name, the Dreadwolf, and was clearly a reference to the Dreadwolf from Dragon Age 3's major reveal, aka Solus, known by many other names too. The Dreadwolf had in the final DLC for Inquisition incited his plans to tear down the veil that protected the lands from the corrupted and arrogant enslaved elven gods who ruled it before, because he wanted to return the power to the elves he had doomed. This game was set to be helmed by creative director Matthew Goldman, a former art director and artist on Dragon Age, after Mike Laidlaw's version of the game was canned. This would have some serious ramifications though, as it would be a contributor to why Laidlaw would later leave. We would find out the following year that this new Dragon Age project was actually fairly like the before cancelled project, which for me wasn't a good sign, because Gator was no longer writing the story, so it wasn't the same thing or idea. It would have to live and grow a bit, which could work or backfire. EA would announce in 2019, however, that DA was a ways off, as many as 3 years off, which would only turn out to be partially true, as it would ultimately drop 5 years later. During this same year, Corin Bush would join the team as the lead systems designer, which would be interesting because they were historically a Sims developer for EA, though quite liked amongst the top brass for being able to drive a team forward. Though according to Corin, this was because Dragon Age was their dream franchise, but still an odd talent acquisition on the surface at least. Dragon Age 4 would finally reveal actual details past teasers August 27, 2020, starting with the behind-the-scenes showcase at BioWare and the team working on the newest Dragon Age game. starting with Mark Darrah and Frame, a longtime BioWare developer and the producer behind the Dragon Age series, followed by some veteran talent and creative director Matthew Goldman, and led by writer Patrick Weeks, a longtime Mass Effect writer and creator of Tali, Jack, and Morden. The issue here was without Gator, now writing had been given to a literal Mass Effect writer, further guaranteeing that the next Dragon Age game was going to be even more Mass Effect-like than the previous ones, which as you remember, was the reason Brent Knowles left the company back after the launch of Dragon Age Origins. Patrick Weeks, later known as Trick Weeks, had some good writing on their resume, but hadn't had any lead writing experience besides the Trespasser DLC for Inquisition, which, I don't like. And they also wrote Solos, Iron Bull, and Cole, all characters I don't really like. And no, not because one is a villain. I mention this because I have a bias against the writing of Weeks from my experience with it outside of sci-fi, and that was a bit worrying. Especially when David Gator was known as the main writer for the series and he had departed, the creator of the core of the cast in Dragon Age, with characters like Morrigan and Alistair. When you compare Weeks' contributions, they're dwarfed by Gator, to be blunt, even though I know it's not some measuring contest, but even at BioWare in general, with Gator being responsible for 3 of the most iconic and well-liked characters in the Star Wars EU, or Expanded Universe, aka KOTOR, Knights of the Old Republic, HK-47, Jolie Bendo, and Cartho Nasi. Okay, that last one is a bit of a stretch to be fair. And again, it's not a competition, but it just means you have massive shoes to fill. Those were deep shoes to fill, because they made the game what the game was, really. Weeks would be aided by narrative director John Epler too, who started as a QA tester at BioWare, and had grown to become the Dragon Age series cinematic designer. According to Epler and Weeks, Dragon Age 4 was a story about a found family, and having to fight against the unjust world, and the sense of inequalities being present, and you being outmatched. This wasn't really inspiring for me, because this also was supposed to be the finale of the story of the previous game's major plotline, which means you will have to fight against time and urgency that goes along with that, while trying to make a found family style story work. Think Guardians of the Galaxy or Avatar: Last Airbender. They didn't just skip to the chemistry part, they had to build that up over time, over the course of multiple films or episodes, or even comics. And they spent a lot of time building the backgrounds of each character and connecting them in interesting ways. But not long after this announcement, there would be some major departure news that would shock the world. More names associated with Dragon Age, and more were departing, such as Casey Hudson, Mike Laidlaw, and Mark Darrah, 2 faces of Dragon Age in more ways than one. The following year would see the departure of the creative director on the project and another longtime BioWare developer too, Matthew Goldman, who would be replaced by John Epler, now acting as creative director. These were some major blows. Mike had been there since the beginning, alongside Darrah, and were 2 key figures in the success of Dragon Age. My feelings during this time were very worried, to be honest. You had more than 3 key developers responsible for the game's success gone, and they were still trying to push on, trying to make the same game. But what game even was that anymore, and what would it become? It wouldn't stop there either. Christian Daly would depart the project after taking over after Mark Darrah's departure, followed by a major shifting in the game's development leadership, with Corin Bush now becoming the game's director in 2022. While I don't understand this transition, based on her history with the company, aka working on The Sims, Corin reportedly was pretty good at getting things done, and considering they were going from leader to leader to leader, at this point they needed someone willing to take the position and make the project work somehow. Was Corin opportunistic? Sure, like most would be in that situation, but if anything, EA put her in a position to fail, really, where they would not really be able to change the entire direction of the game in a mere 2 years, and would likely take any of the negativity the game would receive if it did launch in a not-so-good state, despite joining development like 7 years after it started. But you can't feel sorry for her. They wanted this opportunity. It still was an opportunity to right a failing ship, something you can argue that she was successful at. The following year, and BioWare would be faced with more major layoffs to accompany their major departures. As many as 50 employees would be let go, including Mary Kirby, the creator of the Kunari race and the Star franchise character, Varric. Varric, Alistair, Morrigan, Zevran, Fenris, and more. All of their writers, Gator, Mary Kirby, gone. These characters were Dragon Age, a series often accused of having very little thorough threads through the series. Worse, not only were these character creators gone, and many other core developers on Dragon Age, former Dragon Age staff were seeking further compensation following their layoffs, accusing BioWare of shortchanging them. This, alongside accusations from major developers such as Dara, Gator, and more claiming mismanagement of the Dragon Age series, meant that the BioWare we once knew and loved was not the same anymore. The one who was considered the darling of the video game development and RPG space wasn't the same darling. Dragon Age 4 would undergo some major changes, announced publicly June 2024. First, they would be dropping the 4, renaming it to Dragon Age The Veilguard instead. According to Corin Bush and the team at BioWare, the name change was meant to reflect the overall focus of the game being about the found family experience and working together to stop the veil from being pierced. The interesting thing is this name change came the same year the game was set to release, which means they likely didn't have much time to fully change the game to reflect the name change, which we will circle back about later. As John Epler, creative director, would state in the new BioWare information revealed in the summer of 2024, the Veilguard was about saving the world with your newfound family, reflecting what they felt the series was always about, the characters. But alongside this reveal was a trailer, and in this trailer, you can't help but notice some major changes for the franchise. First, as PC Gamer put it, the game looked like a hero shooter in the trailer, or as Rock Paper Shotgun said, it looked like a Fortnite heist movie, which was honestly super accurate. While PC Gamer would say positively the game looked even more like Mass Effect than before, which for me wasn't a positive, why would it be? You have the Mass Effect series over there already. Why would I want a different series to be more like that one, when one is sci-fi and the other is fantasy? And well, they're different games. That's the issue with Dragon Age though. Since inception, really. It's always struggled with its identity. What makes a game a Dragon Age game? Visually, game design-wise, or gameplay-wise? If you can answer that, let me know in the comments. But I think it's a hard question. Visually, I feel like that answer is about being this dark fantasy. That would then shift after one game to more generic fantasy, and then in another to even more generic fantasy with high graphics. Now arriving to what Veilguard had become, which seemed to be like a Disney reimagining of Dragon Age or something. This art style, according to BioWare, was about being more approachable and looking like in every shot, environmental or character shots and all, like it was in the same game in the same universe. Which is a fair point of criticism for the series, but the thing is, the series' art style was changed since the first game. So if anything, continuing to change it is just doing exactly what the series had already been doing and has been criticized for, giving it further no real identity. Because this isn't a reboot, remember? And the gameplay is now even more Mass Effect in some ways. Dragon Age The Veilguard was now more like a God of War action game with RPG elements than a full-fledged RPG. I mean, you spend time waiting around activating things just to go press another thing for a cutscene to happen or for someone to say something for you to then move on to the next zone. There's a goofy amount of focus too in this reveal from Corin Bush to focus on customization options, which shouldn't be surprising given that they were a Sims dev, but Dragon Age fans don't just want more ways to look, they want more ways to play and feel, something Origin gave fans. Identity isn't just how you look, it's who you are, your connection to the world, and so much more. I really feel BioWare had some good ideas with Veilguard, but a combination of mixed desires, development hell, and poor execution would ultimately plague their next Dragon Age game. There were some signs that things were not as they would seem too. In September of 2024, we would find out, according to Eurogamer, that Veilguard wouldn't allow for you for the first time to control your companions. According to Corin Bush, it was detrimental to the game now, since the game was more like a pure action game than an RPG. Instead, you could only target their abilities like Mass Effect. Worse, according to IGN in their interview with Epler, Dragon Age Veilguard wouldn't really be introducing many of the game's previous changes or choices and carrying them over. That's because ultimately, the story for the game ends the same, with Solas becoming the ultimate villain. This would be controversial, as not only is it the first Dragon Age game to not feature carried over choices, well besides like 3 in particular, it would signify again the feeling that this Dragon Age game wasn't being made for fans of Dragon Age, but to attract another audience altogether, a newer and hopefully bigger audience. EA just didn't think 12 million was good enough, I guess. Dragon Age The Veilguard would drop October 31st, 2024, and what came next was controversial for a number of reasons, starting with the large divide between critics and the player base. Starting with the aggregate review website Metacritic, Dragon Age The Veilguard scoring not far under the first or third game at an 82 out of 100 from 72 different critics. This score was heavily inflated by a few particularly positive reviews we will cover shortly. But before that, I just want to mention the divide is big here, because the player base seems to rate games at a 4 out of 10 instead, which is almost half the critical score, I should add. And on Steam, it would score 67%, a record low for the series. We will talk more about this reception during the gameplay segment, in which I will also offer a lot of my personal experiences with the game as a fan of Dragon Age and someone who is playing Inquisition and Veilguard during the writing of this. Starting with the IGN review, at a 9 out of 10, from one of my favorite writers at IGN, just kidding. They rated Stormgate a freaking 8 out of 10, and they glazed the game for some reason. Anyway, they would call Dragon Age the Veilguard refreshing, and a possible bar for the next Mass Effect game to have to beat. Hafer would claim the game had a fantastic cast of companions and moving character writing. Eurogamer, in one of the most bizarre reviews ever, would review the game at a 10 out of 10, claiming it was the best BioWare game they had ever played. Maybe it was their first. I don't know. I won't spend too much time diving into that review because I would rather not go insane, you know? Most detectives kind of do that at some point. While GameSpot in their 8 out of 10 was calling Dragon Age the Veilguard a return to form for BioWare, though they would acknowledge it had some issues that kept it from being great. Sorry, I think most of the critical reviews on this game are just not very good. So here's my review. Let's talk about the first thing that you're going to notice when you're watching anything or playing anything Veilguard related, and that's the art style. The art style has changed in the series from being dark fantasy to now completing the full spectrum, I guess, to what you would call light fantasy, or as some people would dub, Disney-like. It's colorful, even the browns are bright. The spells are color-coded for what element they represent, though most of your attacks are going to look bright green or bright red most of the time. Now, there are some positives in my view about the new art style. The contrast of it allows for really nice lighting and shading, and the fact is it does look distinctive and catches your eye, especially cinematics at points, but at the same time, looks downright horrible in some other views. I mean, sometimes cinematics or character talking head moments look very weird, and I don't like many of the art changes, like making Kunari look more friendly or stylized, or how the Darkspawn look like killing floor monsters now for some reason. I don't think these are welcomed additions. I also just feel like the actual style of Dragon Age has been completely abandoned now, which just feels unnecessary when this could have been a moment to recenter your art style back to the most popular game critically amongst critics and players originally, Origins. Though, because Inquisition had more success being generic art with high graphics, that was maybe unlikely. Hence a change like this with a desire for more players. But why go in a more stylized direction when the content and rating of the game is mature? I have no idea. If you already showed you could sell with the generic art style, why not just make it a little darker? It feels as conflicting as when Saints Row decided to do it with their reboot, even though this wasn't a reboot, another title we covered in the Death of a Game series. Let's talk about the gameplay in Veilguard, another stark difference to the typical gameplay in the series, but again, what even is typical with a series that changes gameplay from every game? If anything, Veilguard is just a natural conclusion of that, one that was headed towards being more of a straight action game since Dragon Age 2. I don't particularly think the change is warranted or really hits for me, but I can't sit here and say the combat system is complete ass either. It's just basically the Mass Effect combat system at this point, and that's a negative for me. Even on the highest difficulty playthrough, I was having no trouble dispatching threats without any thinking needed. Hell, the times I did think on boss fights and I lost, I just switched tactics to just rushing them down and not thinking, and it almost works all the time as a default strategy, further making the combat feel quite boring and very one-note. It's like a worse Kingdom Hearts. UI. The UI for me is just a major miss. I don't get the color scheming, even if it's meant to match the game's like logo colors, because those colors are rarely even seen in the game. So it stands out, but like in a bad way. Also, not only do you have this like huge blocky base UI, it has less information than all the previous Dragon Age games, making it feel more simplified, like it was made for children, when this game is rated M. RPG aspects. Despite the action combat, Dragon Age at its core is about choices and being an RPG. Veilguard offers the worst RPG experience yet, reducing your choices down to, in key moments, to just 2 choices. Oftentimes even having to dictate what companions or other people you don't even know want to do. You're given a story background, and then instead of playing it out, you're told repeatedly throughout the series, including by yourself, you talk to yourself about your past, instead of being able to play it, which is what made Origins so unique. The way DA2 and Inquisition went about approaching that was making the game your story or start. But in the case of Veilguard, you play as Rook, who already has a background with people they know and interacted with, and you know basically nothing about it, minus what is conveniently told to you at random bits, annoyingly even, which for me felt more like they were trying to convince themselves more than me. Trying to do a found family style story with the character you have yet to craft their history or past to was going to be a tough barrier, which brings me to my next point about the game. The companions, they're fairly controversial, though most of that's being aimed at just one character in particular. But we're going to cover all 7 of the characters very briefly, and some of the other key characters in the game too, starting with Lace Harding, a returning character from Inquisition, who was the scout for them there. The problem is, she has way too much naivety and inexperiencedness to be as experienced and vetted as she actually is. She starts off also pretty lackadaisical, but improves a lot as the game continues on, to be fair. Neve, we have a Raven-like wannabe character from Teen Titans. The difference being, Raven is half demon and can't show too much feelings lest her father, a demon, escape from inside of her, and she's still charming in her own way. What is Neve's excuse? She's a detective? Detectives, angry or edgy or not, have charisma. They're still likable. And they still have this dorky idealism about them. I think they forgot to write that part into Neve's story, who joins the cast because, and I quote, "people are messing up her city." You mean the world is unfolding before our very eyes? But Lara, she's one of the best characters actually. Sure, she talks a lot, but she's helpful, good-spirited, and has a whimsical cuteness about her. Tash. Okay, here comes the controversy. Time to wade into it. Tash, or Tosh, is a Kunari sex female who comes across quite autistic. Source, an autist in me, but is actually more of the story of a young adult who's stuck in an identity crisis of their gender, a real issue many people are suffering from in our real world. However, it's 2026, and although the concepts of other genders have existed since ancient times, we are only now starting to classify these things. Just think about that. Which means, why the hell are characters in a fantasy game so focused on this when they don't even have all of their needs being met in a mechanical sense or technology yet? You don't just skip to progressivism without having some sort of foundation for things. And the foundation in Dragon Age was not a world that was very accepting of things. And one of your first interactions with Tosh is them being sensitive about feeling like you were trying to typecast them as a certain kind of person. Meanwhile, you just met them, and you know nothing about them, which is sometimes a problem people occur when they're going through identity crises or have traumatic issues. It doesn't also help that half the time the lip sync doesn't even seem to work on Tosh either, ironically for some reason. Basically, this character is having a very real modern gender crisis, but it's inserted into a Dragon Age game that doesn't even have technology and forced onto the plate of the main character, Rook, who must serve now as a sort of therapist. For some reason? Look, I'm not qualified in real life to process my own trauma, hence why I got therapy, let alone someone else's. And then there's the infamous scene featuring a classic character of the series, Isabella, and the Tosh scene. Isabella and Tosh have this scene that happens near the end of the game, which is totally random to the plot. Isabella, despite knowing Tosh quite well, accidentally genders them, who prefers they/them pronouns at the time. Instead of using this as a teaching moment in the game, or even a moment of brevity, they turn it into one of the most cringe moments in gaming I have ever witnessed. Isabella stresses she must now endure physical strain and shame to account for her sins of making a mistake, and furthers this by insulting other people and other ways of thinking, by typecasting all people who apologize as people without true intent to be sorry and people who just want to sweep their issues under the rug. This is insanely arrogant and bigoted, and is just projection. And it does not help the cause you're trying to help here. Instead, it brings hate to the cause, a lightning rod to the cause, and makes it easier to dismiss. You have to give people a chance to be sorry, a chance to learn things, like what the difference between a gender and a sex is, or other simple concepts, especially when you are non-binary, claiming you don't have a male or female gender someone can easily identify. Being shut off completely to others doesn't help your cause. It hurts it. It preaches that you are just as intolerant as others that are intolerant against you. And it comes across as a nasty kind of preachiness that does little to bring more people to your cause. And that's where we have to address the elephant in the room. That many people feel that Tosh, and the story of Veilguard in general, is a bit of an insert of ideas and feelings from its lead writer, a trans writer, Trick Weeks. And well, all stories and characters are influenced by those who write them, duh. The key is not letting your characters become too influenced by your own real world. The reason being is because oftentimes that comes with blind spots, uncomfortable situations that aren't really fun or interesting to other people, and more. If Weeks wanted to have a trans identity or out-of-group feeling be a serious topic in the game because of the recent transition they experienced in the past few years, they could have done it without making it so on the nose, which is going to turn nearly everyone else off. When trans people, despite what some loonies might say, are just a minority of people. They aren't the boogeyman, nor an audience large enough to fund a AAA game on its own. You could have left the identity stuff to their companion questing alone, tied it in with the codex and journal entries, and let players arrive at their own conclusions, without chastising. Give them the space to learn and make their own choices, like adults do. I blame this in some ways on Weeks' inexperience with their newfound gender, if anything. You could have said there were special genetic traits that affected some Kunari and made some hermaphrodite, or maybe not even have genitals. Hell, you could have even said that this Kunari has a special and weird horn, and everyone else feels that they just don't belong, which gives them an identity crisis. There were so many more ways to do it, but what do I know? I also feel NB, but you never knew that, did you? See my point? Anyway, we have more characters to cover quickly, such as, in my opinion, the game's best character in Imric, a charming older gentleman necromancer who is both highbrow and silly, managing to inject some well-balanced comedic relief and expertise to the team and family. And then you have Davrin, who is the total bro of the game, a Grey Warden whose personality and story is wrapped all around that too. Then finally, you have Lucanus, who, the best way to describe him is like a half-demon, half-human, without that much of a dichotomy of that being on display. So his character just feels like a tepid execution of the trope. If anything, he feels more like a Starbucks barista, while being an assassin hosted by a demon. There's just so much missed opportunity here, even if they wanted to make him metrosexual. Rook. Yeah, we're gonna cover you, the main character too. You have been given more of a voice on your own than ever before, or sometimes you can't even choose what your character is going to say, with them saying things that are also like passing judgments, or agreeing with stuff that other characters say that you can't even make decisions about. If they wanted to make you more of a pre-existing character, they should have given you, I don't know, an origin? But I hated how much my character inserted themselves into the plot, despite feeling like I was ultimately rather inconsequential compared to the other people around me anyway, like Dorian, Morrigan, Varric, and more. I mean, the reason for me even being involved in the first place was super tepid. Why on earth would I, with a random background, be the person tasked by Varric to stop Solus? Maybe this could work if you gave me a character that already had some power to them, but when I started the game with an acolyte staff and people are talking about how I'm supposed to be the one that saves the day, it's just jarring, and not believable at all. That started from the very beginning of the game for me, sadly. Rook is the least believable and relatable main character in the entire series. And most of that comes from the fact that they have way too much of a personality for a character that you're supposed to be playing as. But also simultaneously don't know them as a character, so you don't know their personality. It's just suddenly being inserted into different situations and writing situations and dialogue. Story. Let's talk about the story in Veilguard, which is about the Veilguard, despite this never being uttered a single time in the game. Meanwhile, Dreadwolf is said dozens of times, so the basis of the name change in the game itself already sort of falls short out of the gate. But as much as some of you might want me to say the whole thing is shit, to be honest, Veilguard's story is okay. It's not great, it's not bad. If anything, the poor dialogue throughout the game just makes the whole thing worse. Characters rarely seem to connect with each other or their environment, and all speak to the protagonist like they're 12 years old. There's some sarcasm, but nothing controversial in any of the companion characters' personalities presented besides, well, Tosh. Everyone just seemed flippant about the world ending, and even dealing with Solas, like Varric, who he and we already knew at this point was not who he said he was. I will say though, the story of Solas and Veilguard is the best thing they have here. Seriously. And I say that as a Solas hater, as I already admitted. It's really enjoyable once you get to watch all the murals and read the codex entries about it. What you uncover is a story of love, betrayal, and idealism resulting in someone never being satisfied with being on the wrong side of things. An idealism at all costs. If anything, if this was more of the story, there could have been so much more here to tell. Instead, the story ends up being told like Harry Potter, where you, Rook, are somehow the chosen one because Solus wanted to manipulate you, or something, making you feel rather inconsequential again in the plot. Really, it's a story of Mythal, the protector, all-mother, and goddess of love, and Solas's irresponsible actions and love with each other that led to the very tearing of the world. Something ultimately undone in a way that makes it all feel like the story might have been trying to convince you initially of Solas's point of view, and he was right to free everybody, but then gave up like halfway through, instead making the game more about overcoming all odds and evil. It's like they had all this complexity and just decided at the end to get rid of it and make it more about choosing the Disney ending or the Disney journey instead, which actually sells Veilguard quite short in the end. I should say, despite my criticism of them not seeming to believe or follow their own main plot enough, the companion quests in the game are easily the best quests in the game, letting you learn more about each character in ways you literally can't since you can only talk when they give you permission back at the base. It's like the Mass Effect system, but worse. So even if I like most of the companion questing, the overall system is just a bit of a dud. My closing thoughts on Veilguard are as follows. I think it's a decent game. If it's not a Dragon Age game that cost potentially like 150 to 250 million and took 9 years to make. So if you remove all context from it, say for example, you are a completely fresh player to it, you might find something likable and enjoyable here. But this isn't Dragon Age. Not really, at least. It's more like Dragon Age Survivor Effect. And most people who know me know how much I hate Jedi Survivor. In a shocking development to the case, Orrin Bush would depart just months after the game's release, and days after some major layoffs, with claims she was offered a job she couldn't turn down, which would reportedly be one from Wizards of the Coast. Now look, I'm not dumb. I know Orrin Bush will be in many people's crosshairs as well, but I really feel they are a lesser of the evil, if any bad, in the situation. They were a game director, not creative director, meaning they were in charge of making sure the game even launched in the first place, not a guiding force creatively, which was more of the problem that I had with the game. If anything, Bush did well enough in that situation that they were given, though they had to have some inklings or ideas that they were sort of going to be falling on the sword at least a little bit, unless their game somehow did really well. Or maybe just too trusting of their relationship with EA. But in the end, Bush released the game. They did their job. But we have to talk about the two major actual creative forces driving on the project, and that was Epler and Weeks. Epler seemed to be the one to really hone in and focus on the found family concept in the game. A concept that, again, intuitively makes sense, but doing it in the 4th iteration of the game that had a continued storyline from the most recent game, it just feels strange because suddenly you're expecting players to form bonds with characters they just met over a plot that predates those characters and is way more important than them, all the while telling them, hurry up, the world is ending. It's just not a good setting for a found family sort of game, and if you want to make it work, you have to really slow the pace down, which is not what they wanted with Veilguard, remember? They wanted it to be a shorter, more narrative-focused experience, even from the beginning, back in 2015. In Weeks is the other largest target in many people's crosshairs concerning why they think Veilguard wasn't a good game. That's because, while they are a classic BioWare developer, as I said, responsible for characters like Jack, Tali, and Morden in Mass Effect, weeks later in their life discovered they felt better described as non-binary instead, which would include a wardrobe and look change too. Inevitably, as the leader of the project, they're going to be blamed for the most negative parts of the game's story and writing, and since it was overly millennial and trivial feeling, coinciding with their change of identity in real life, these things are going to be points of contention for people, even dummies. But the overly millennial and trivial feel of things and characters' responses to a world-ending threat is just problematic. Like Tosh, as we described before, which I get it, they're a kid, but like, this is a mature Dragon Age game. I don't really want to like have to deal with somebody's gender identity. This for me brings the point of discussion to the forefront. Many are echoing in the comments now, probably. Which is, was this story a bit of a self-insert? Modernization of the fantasy series? Honestly, probably. That's how inspirations work after all. But the problem in Veilguard isn't the woke agenda or some nonsense, it's that they put a Mass Effect writer in charge of Dragon Age, and expected anything other than a Mass Effect-like story to be produced, including after changing the gameplay to play like Mass Effect 2. Weeks didn't write on Origins, the second game, and only really wrote primarily on the DLCs for the third game, though they did a great job at that. But now you don't have the main creators of Dragon Age around to help you, all the while you are likely being told from above that you need to try to appeal to a newer, broader audience, instead of appealing to your already nearly dozen million players of the past, in the end failing to really appeal to anyone that well at all. It's a heavy burden for anyone to take, especially someone undergoing some changes of their own. But don't worry, people in the comments will still be sensitive about this sort of thing and ignoring any of the stuff that's actually being said. And also using it as an opportunity to display their own bigotry and ignorance regarding subjects like gender. But don't worry, I'm sure they'll show their sensitive side when I make fun of their bigotry for some reason, which is much the same that they're doing to others less fortunate and capable of defending themselves. Capiche? Yeah. That's because not only is Veilguard rated poorly amongst fans of the series, it literally underperformed its projections by as much as 50%, only being able to reach 1.5 million players, and not the expected 3 million. Veilguard would later find itself on Game Pass that same year. EA would postulate that the game would have sold better had it been live service, which many felt was a sign of what was to potentially come for the new Mass Effect game BioWare was working on too. BioWare, as a response to their lack of success, would cut some of their staff, such as the main writer and creative behind Dragon Age Veilguard, Trick Weeks, and also restructure some too, for example, like John Epler, the former creative director on Dragon Age the Veilguard, who would be shifted to the creative director on Skate. What a freaking transition. And one that again shows you that you can ship a failure in the video game industry, one that you were probably responsible in some way for, and just because it's a blimp on your resume, it counts as experience. Good enough to get you a bigger or parallel level job or project. It's nuts. No shade or anything, really, but kind of crazy that months after the game came out, they jumped ship to an entirely other company within the same company, one that would go on to barely score 6 out of 10 from users on Steam, with it being a strictly online Skate experience filled with microtransactions. Oh yeah, Nepler's in charge of the seasonal content, so take with that what you will. Mark Dara and Mark Dara, who I've said his name like 6 different ways in this video, would start making YouTube content concerning his extensive game development experience, and would make the claim in the summer of 2026 that Dragon Age as a series, in his eyes, was dead. Partly because it was, as David Gator had said, never a good match for EA, and the other part being they never really knew what to make of the game. Him and many other developers at Dragon Age seemed to be happy, even solemnly. The franchise was reaching an end, which is hard to blame them for. It's one that since the beginning was marred with development issues, especially after the massive success of their first game. Really, without trying to fake any sympathy here, Dragon Age as a series, unlike Mass Effect, didn't quite get the fairest of shade. It got ran through the ringer a bit more. It was the ugly step-sibling, an ugly duckling never quite lasting long enough or strong enough on its own to form its own identity, which is to say that Dragon Age as a series could have been so much more. Origins and Inquisition were just glimpses of that, but the series was capable of so much more. And that's where I will echo sentiments with Mark Dara here, who, by the way, for a producer, as much as I rag on them in video game development, is very knowledgeable about game development, which is that Dragon Age needs a full reboot, a revive. And no, not the Saints Row kind. It needs a new setting, or a newly realized world, new characters, new fresh faces. This will actually allow them to do what they tried to do with Veilguard and recapture an identity for the game and what they wanted it to be, instead of a series of 4 games all different from each other on core levels. But the timeline has come to an end, detectives. We have caught up with the recent times. No new news has really been dropped concerning the Dragon Age series, and this is not surprising considering the failure of Veilguard and the current focus of all hands on deck on the newest to come Mass Effect game, which is trying to do much of what I just recently said concerning making a new lifeboat for the series to continue to float on with. And so, why did the Veilguard have a reception according to fans even worse than the hated Dragon Age 2? And how did it go on to be one of the most high-profile failures we have seen, with development rumored in the cost of 150 to 250 million in a development cycle that spanned nearly 10 years? Well, in case you weren't following any of the clues as they presented themselves along the way, abandoning what little Dragon Age tenets existed or remained, a lack of a strong identity, rocky development cycle, and mass key developer departures. EA corporate just burned talent over time and disrespected their workers and IPs. Feels like a magical story set far too much into modern times and culture. Sold half as well as expected according to projections. Dragon Age, the Vanguard. The final point really just puts a bow on this case for me. Dragon Age, the Vanguard. Feels more like it was made by fans of the game, sure, but not in the sense that you might be thinking. No, it feels like someone else wrote for a series they didn't originally write for, and was trying to reverse engineer what made it all good, and in the end, was far off of that target. Dragon Age was a dark and gritty RPG that covered controversial situations and subjects, sure, but did it with an epic fantasy feel, not with a modern twang. But I also think it's telling when you see developers like Epler, who was the narrative designer and then later on creative director, still consider Veilguard a victory lap of sorts. BioWare isn't the same company and hasn't been for some time now, most of you know that, but Dragon Age the Veilguard was likely our last notification of that change, before everything from this point on is now that status quo. We will see what comes of the newest Mass Effect game being cooked up by the remainder of BioWare now, still managing to feature some classic talent. But after following the development cycles of Anthem, and now Dragon Age the Veilguard, I have very low hopes. Sorry, detectives. We end this case on a bit of a downer, which I don't normally do. But until the next case, which will be one of our most creative cases yet, let me know what you thought of Dragon Age as a series in the comments below, and tell me specifically your thoughts on Veilguard. But until the next case, which will be one of our most creative cases yet.